Okay, let's begin inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum everyone. I would like to welcome all of you from different parts of the world. Welcome to our program. Today we have a very important guest. But first, I would like to give you some information about the Madrasa program and the Madrasa speech. Sahn Madrasa has been active for about 2 years. It's run by a non-profit institution offering postgraduate education in Islamic and social studies in Istanbul. It's located in the campus of the elite Madrasa of the same name, originally founded by the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. The Madrasa offers to its students a great range of educational programs. In the Madrasa Research Center, various speech and projects were initiated in the last 2 years. As the first activity, a one-day symposium was held in May 2018. Since October 2018, the Madrasa Conversations series has been launched on the history and studies of the Madrasa, and within this framework, many precious academicians were hosted with conferences. These conferences provide an opportunity to bring together to introduce relevant experts and researchers, producing a productive discussion atmosphere. As I said in the beginning, we have a very distinguished guest with us, Dr. Talal Al-Azem. He is Muhammad Nuh Fellow at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies and lecturer in Islamic Theology and History at the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford. His research focuses on social and intellectual history of the Muslim world, with particular attention to institutions of law and learning in the medieval and early modern Near East. Dr. Al-Azem received his DPhil from the University of Oxford Faculty of Oriental Studies in 2011. He obtained his BA in History and Near Eastern Studies from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Before joining the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, he was a lecturer in Islamic History at the Faculty of Oriental Studies, Oxford. From 2014 and 15, he was a research officer on the Islamic Philosophy and Theology project. Today, inshallah, Dr. Al-Azem will speak about the purposes of a madrasa education. He will focus on some questions like the purpose of madrasa education in the pre-modern Muslim world, and how education was conceptualized and practiced in Islamicized cities and learning, and how the madrasa functioned within a broader vision of the individual and society. Now, inshallah, we will speak to Dr. Al-Azem about 45-50 minutes. Then you can write your questions to chat box. Then at the end of the program, I will ask these questions to Dr. Al-Azem, inshallah. Dr. Al-Azem, the floor is yours. Tafadhali.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa barak ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق الهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره ومقداره العظيم. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا فعلمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. Thank you very much, Dr. Ismail. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this series of events, including Ustaz Omar, who's been in touch with me over the past months very patiently, helping organize this participation of mine. And it's good to see an old friend, Dr. Ismail, here today. Let me just begin by sharing my slides here. Could I just get a confirmation? Are the slides showing correctly?
Yes, Ustad.
Okay.
You can show it. You can see it.
Okay, good. Very good in that case. Yep, here we are. Okay, I'd like to begin today this presentation on the purpose of a madrasa education with one of the most central maxims or qawaid of Islamic legal philosophy. Indeed, the very first maxim that's found in the Majalla, the legal code that was put together in the late Ottoman Empire. Al-umuru bi maqasidiha. Matters are in accordance with their ends. In terms of Islamic moral philosophy, for something developed or adopted to be deemed Islamic, it must not negate or vitiate the ends of the sacred law, whether directly or indirectly. Our discussion today, inshallah, is entitled The Purpose of a Madrasa Education. And in what follows, I'd like to take a historically rooted approach to the philosophy, the purpose of a madrasa education. Now, as a starting point, I think we can all agree that it's a given that social systems, practices, and structures all cultivate different types of people, or what we might call different formations of the self. And these formations are ultimately determined by that society's own highest ends, or in the classical Islamic language, that society's maqasid. So for example, if the highest ends of a society is wealth creation, then it will necessarily seek to cultivate persons that facilitate wealth creation above all else. It'll accentuate the acquisitive tendencies of the human soul, and it will sublimate the reflective or the more magnanimous aspects of the soul. So what I'd like to think about here are, what are the ends, or what are the maqasid of a madrasa education? What's the purpose of a madrasa education historically? Okay, and what does this mean for the type of human self that is fashioned and formed? So the basic question can really be reformulated. What type of human person does a madrasa education produce? That is to say, what kind of sensibilities, what kind of self, what did the total educational experience seek to cultivate? What kind of institutions and practices were used to ensure this? Whether inside the madrasa or as part of the student's broader educational experience, of which a madrasa was one part. And finally, what is the relationship of the social experience of a madrasa education? What is its relationship to ensuring a particular vision as to the vision of knowledge in that society? Okay, and how does it empower individual scholars to master knowledges outside of the madrasa curriculum, on the other hand? So in other words, what vision of the nature and purpose of knowledge? What is knowledge's nature, and what is knowledge's purpose? How do we tie these three questions, in other words, together? So to answer these questions, I think we need to tease out from our historical materials a number of things. We need to tease out the conceptual vocabulary, analyze it, and understand in the very language that pre-modern Muslims use to talk about knowledge and learning and the madrasa and other forms of education, what does this vocabulary tell us about how they thought about these first three questions? We need likewise to survey the institutional landscape. Okay, so how were the various institutions of education related to one another? What roles did they play individually? And what roles did they play taken as a whole in society? And finally, what were some of the social practices developed or adopted by Muslims as products of the madrasa? Okay, so these are the three points that we will be going through successively in today's presentation. The conceptual vocabulary of learning and of the madrasa, the institutional landscape within which the madrasa is situated, and some of the social practices that were meant to cultivate this vision of learning and of knowledge. So before we begin, I want to lay out a few caveats, a few things that we need to bear in mind when approaching a subject like this through a historical lens. Naturally, in speaking about intellectual history, or any form of history, we're speaking about a remove of time. We look at pre-modern societies not only through a remove of time, but also through a remove of experience. So that is to say, we don't experience cultural artifacts with which they interacted in the way that they did. We don't experience the social relations that structure people's everyday lives the way that they did. And we don't experience the physical world, whether built institutions like the Madrasa or the Tekke or other institutions, in the way that they did. Okay. In other words, we have to keep in mind that though we're trying to excavate a past, both materially and intellectually, we're at a remove, and we must bear this remove in mind. Now, while intellectual historians have generally been successful, I would argue, in excavating the vocabulary and terminology of past cultures by reconstituting their texts and situating these ideas and texts in relation to one another, I think there's still much that could be done to better understand how they experienced and why they valued these ideas and concepts in their lives and in society. So this is to say that we have still much to learn about what they saw when they looked out into or onto these various landscapes, and why. Much more effort is still required in trying to understand how the ideas and concepts were embodied. This is, I think, my main point in this introduction that I want to make very clear. We still have a lot of work to do to understand how ideas and concepts were embodied in pre-modern Muslim societies' social landscapes, and how these ideas and concepts were materialized in their physical landscapes or in their built environments. Okay, and ultimately, how they reflected the moral landscapes of their cultures. Now, in order to do all this work, I think we need to ask a number of questions. We need to ask questions such as, what can we learn from analyzing the intellectual landscape of pre-modern Muslim societies in terms of their social structures, their built environments, and their moral culture? What concepts did members of that society use to think and speak about their own intellectual, moral, physical landscapes? And what body of moral and ethical values did they weave into the ideas and practices of their cultures? Okay, so hopefully we're going to unpack some of this in the rest of the presentation to come. Now, as I can't obviously cover everything in a 45-minute to 1 hour presentation, so what I'm going to do is actually share with you some work that I've been undertaking for the past 5 or 6 years, and that I'm hopefully in the final stages of writing up as a monograph. A work that explores some of these very questions through a micro study of late medieval education. So as an example of this type of inquiry, in other words, I'd like to briefly introduce you now to the subject and the case study of the work and of this presentation. Much of today's presentation then is on research that I'm doing currently into the 15th and 16th centuries in Syria and Egypt. And the focus of my study is the educational life and writings of the historian of Damascus, the laqab that he was given, Mu'arrikh Dimashq, of Abdul Qadir Nu'aymi, who lived in the latter half of the 15th century of the Common Era and the first quarter of the 16th century. He dies just a few years after Sultan Salim's conquest of the Mamluk realm and of Damascus. So I'm going to just give a very quick word for the audience today about my case study, Nu'aymi, and about late medieval Damascus, before we go back and start thinking about the topic of the bigger topic of today's presentation. Muhyiddin Abdul Qadir Nu'aymi was born in Damascus in Shawwal 845, February 1442. He was born in Bab al-Jabia in South Damascus, next to the Mamluk era Jami' Manjak, and next to a Rifa'i Zawiya. And we'll return to the significance of these two things a little bit later for his own education as a child. He took the khirqa of Sufism, that of the Qadiri tariqa, and he studied with many famous Shafi'i Ash'ari scholars, but also with Hanbalis, including grandchildren of the famous Maqdisi family of Salihiyya, with Hanafis and with Malikis. As a scholar and an author himself, most of his own efforts were directed primarily to traditional disciplines, especially history and hadith. And in his own life, he became, towards the end of his life, known as the Mu'arrikh Dimashq, the historian of Damascus. He also served as a Shafi'i judge, and he died in the year 1521 at the age of 82. Nu'aymi authored about 20 works, approximately 10 of them in Tarikh, in history, chronicles, biographies, biographical dictionaries. And many of these were actually focused exclusively or nearly exclusively on Damascus. Only 2 of his works are actually known to still exist today. The first is Tanbih al-Talib wa Irshad al-Daris li Ahwal Mawadi' al-Fa'ida bi Dimashq Kadur al-Quran wal Hadith wal Madaris, the book on the left side. And the second one, Al-Unwan fi Bayan Mawalid wa Wafayat Ahl al-Zaman. The first book is a historical catalog of Damascus's colleges and institutions of learning. Each type of institution of learning, such as colleges of Quran or colleges of Hadith, colleges of the madhabs of fiqh, colleges of medicine, but also khanaqahs and jami'as and other institutions, each type of institution receives a chapter. The colleges are then presented in the chronological order of their foundation, and he proceeds to deliver notices of each of the professors who taught there until his own age. To my knowledge, this is the very first history of educational institutions produced in the pre-modern Muslim world. On the other hand, the Unwan, as the title suggests, comprises brief notices, biographical notices of the scholars whom Nu'aymi met in his own life. It's an intensely local history, focusing as it does on scholars who taught in Damascus, and also, insofar as it only treats those scholars who Nu'aymi himself met, it's a very personal biographical dictionary. So in other words, in the Unwan, we have a very specific window into a very specific time in a very specific place. It's the Unwan that I am editing as part of the monograph that I'm hopefully producing soon. And it serves as the control of the study into the practices and culture of education in late medieval Damascus. So I'd like to turn now to some of the findings of this research. And this will help us address our bigger question later in the presentation. In order to better contextualize the question of how education was structured and conceptualized in late medieval Damascus, I'm going to outline some of the social intellectual culture as described in Nu'aymi's writing. So first, as to scholarly affiliations, from Nu'aymi's unwan, it appears that in his lifetime, in the late 15th, early 16th century Damascus, it is the Shafi'i madhab that dominates Damascus, even though all four madhabs are represented. We know from his student Ibn Tulun that Hanafism comes to take at least an equal standing with the coming of the Ottomans in the last few years of Nu'aymi's life. Secondly, and interestingly, the creedal affiliations that arise again and again in the Unwan is Al-Ash'ari Al-Athari, whereby the latter term seems to indicate an emphasis on scriptural or Athar-based approaches to Ash'ari creed, perhaps with less of an emphasis on kalam and more speculative dimensions of the creed. And finally, the third affiliation that dominates is that of the Qadiri Tariqa or Sufi order. Apparently introduced to Damascus by the Hanbali Maqdisi family soon after the Tariqa's appearance in 12th century Baghdad with Sheikh Abdul Qadir. It's in Nu'aymi's age that effectively that this Tariqa is really the only Tariqa mentioned in Damascus. Okay, so this gives you a little bit of sense of the culture. I'm obviously summarizing here, but something of the culture of the intellectual landscape during Nu'aymi's time. As far the second thing that arises in Nu'aymi's writings is the existence of what we might call a college culture. So the spread of endowed educational institutions between the 11th and 15th centuries meant that by Nu'aymi's age, the social as well as the moral landscape of Damascus had been utterly transformed. This is why we see in travel literature, such as that of Ibn Jubayr, that he identifies Damascus as a city of education par excellence. So there are two areas in Damascus in which most of the madrasas are concentrated: the Northwest College Quarter and As-Salihiyya, the quarter founded by the Hanbali Maqdisi family in the 12th and 13th centuries. Now, this rise of colleges, to borrow the term from George Maqdisi, in turn led to a professionalization of education with stable and often competitive stipends for teachers and students at both the primary, but also at the college madrasa level. And in the case of the colleges, this transformed and also changed the social lives of our professionalized educators. So teachers, such as the many teachers Nu'aymi mentions of his own, were often born into the madrasas, often lived their entire lives in the madrasas, and sometimes even died in the madrasas. So in other words, there's a madrasa culture that is dominant within the educational landscape. This dominant educational culture came with many material benefits, with, as I said, the professionalization of learning. And sometimes this led to potential or actual abuses of the system of education. So this led, in the period of the century or two before Nu'aymi, to the appearance of new manuals, pieces of writing, books, that outline the adab of madrasa-based education. So whereas earlier books on the adab of learning, such as those of Burhanuddin al-Zarnuji, focused on the etiquette of learning more generally, we see in books such as that of Ibn Jama'ah and others, a focus now on the proper way of learning in a culture dominated by colleges, by madrasas. And we also see new mechanisms, both adab-based, so internal mechanisms, and punitive mechanisms through the muhtasib to control abuses that could arise due to this new professional environment of the colleges. Okay, so again, this is something that serves as a backdrop, an important social backdrop to the writings of Nu'aymi that we're using now to begin to address the first of the three questions I posed at the beginning of my presentation. So I'm going to begin now with the first of the three, which is by an analysis of the conceptual vocabulary that arises in the writings of Nu'aymi and many others besides him in this time period. So if we look at the vocabulary, which Nu'aymi and other scholars and students used to talk about the educational process, this, I hope, will help us by serving as a window into the way that pre-modern Muslims thought about learning and about its objectives. So the first of our two terms, ta'lim and tadris, signal the transfer of positivistic forms of knowledge. Positivistic forms of knowledge. So ta'lim denotes formal instruction, most commonly in a formal teacher-student relationship. So the muallim, or the instructor, is a person who's been commissioned to systematically develop a student's understanding of a specific subject, law, speculative theology, medicine, etc. The second, tadris, is the delivery of a lecture, a dars, and it represents a more ritualized dimension of formal knowledge transmission. On the other hand, the latter two terms, ta'deeb and tarbiyah, denote the educative formation, or we might say reformation, of the internal dimensions of the human person. So ta'deeb conveys the inculcation of virtues, of moral discipline, and of the manners of proper conduct, of adab. And in the context of learning, the term ta'deeb was most closely associated with primary education of children. Tarbiyah, which means to rear or to nurture or to train, reflects the educative process that transforms the person over time, causing them to mature from a state of juvenility to maturity. Now, both ta'deeb and tarbiyah denote a principled and programmatic approach to character formation. Now, I don't need to mention, I think, to today's audience that these two forms of knowledge, both the positivistic and the character formation of knowledge, formation of the individual, these two were not antagonistic, okay? And neither were their social institutional manifestations. What do I mean by this? Positivistic knowledge was largely transferred and taught in the Madrasa, in the colleges, as we saw earlier, be they colleges of law, colleges of hadith, colleges of medicine, etc. And the formation of character and intellect were either in the maktab for the children or in the khaniqa, the tekke, the zawiyah. So these two types of institutions, whether we're speaking about Damascus or we're speaking about North Africa or the Anatolian realm or India, these two the Madrasa and the Khanaqa were both seen as necessarily complementary. Okay, and we'll see this point raised a little bit later again. Okay. Now, this graph that you see here is a reflection of some of the most commonly used terms by Nu'aymi in his biographical entries in Al-Unwan, the book that I mentioned that is being currently edited. Okay, they provide something of a catalog of professions which are based upon learning in the late 9th century of the Hijrah or the late 15th century of the Common Era. And we can summarize these professions based upon learning of or these titles, I should say, into two types. First, those which reflect a role in cultivating learning, like Al-Allama or Al-Alim, scholar, Al-Musannif, authors, Mudarris, college teachers, etc. And secondly, those titles or professions that require learning, but are not themselves directly related to the educational enterprise, such as Qadi or judge, Mufti, Muaqqit, the timekeeper, Mu'adhin, Adil, a witness, or Khatib, sermonizer, etc. Now, what I want to actually point out here, especially, is that in Nu'aymi's notices, there's also a very rich number of terms that reflect the moral assessment of Nu'aymi when he's writing his biographies. So after the very common terms Allama or Alim or Qadi al-Qudat, the term that Nu'aymi most commonly prepends, puts before a scholar's name is as-Salih. And sometimes the term Salih is actually conspicuously absent, which might reflect also Nu'aymi's assessment of that scholar. Another common descriptive term is Rabbani, the godly. So these terms are consistently placed before the names of sheikhs who are the moral pillars of the scholarly society, but also of wider society. In other words, they were worthy of being learned from by how they were, how they lived their lives, not just what they taught. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that these terms are a form of marking the moral standing of the scholar in society. And more importantly, the various modes of educating that we've already discussed, tarbiyah, ta'lim, ta'deeb, tadris, these are also reflected in some of the terms outlined here on this slide in front of you, such as Muaddib al-Atfal, which literally means he who inculcates adab into children. Of course, what it meant as a profession was a primary school teacher. But this shows that the understanding was that the primary role of the school teacher for children was to inculcate adab. Okay, so this reflects something of both scholarly practices, but also educational goals. So we can see here from everything that's preceded so far, from our treatment of this conceptual vocabulary, that the moral was not ancillary, it was not accidental to the process of education. It was not accidental to the functionaries of education. Ta'deeb, or the inculcation of adab, of propriety, of moral virtue, was most central to the educational endeavor. Okay, so this is a quick treatment of some of the conceptual vocabulary. What I want to turn to now is the institutional landscape, and for us to pay particular attention to what role the madrasa, the college, played within the typology of institutions which is to follow. Okay, so we'll be looking now at how Nuaimi in his various writings listed the various places of education. So here we have a summative overview of the various places where education in one form or another took place in the 15th and 16th centuries. Okay. Now, due to the restrictions of time, I'm only going to say a few words about some of these, okay, such as the libraries, workshops, complexes, and cemeteries. And rather, I'd like to focus on the first 5 particularly in order to situate the Madrasa, the subject of our presentation, in this landscape, okay? So let's begin with childhood. Before speaking even about the Maktab, we need to acknowledge, of course, that the most universal of institutions, the family, as being the big place where the educational experience of the child often began, both formally and informally. We have many examples in the writings of Nuaimi and others about how the father or the mother, sometimes an uncle or an aunt or a grandparent, would be the student's first teacher. And authors, in writing their biographical dictionaries, would often mention this specifically. We have many examples of hadith classes being read in which the men and the women of the family were listed in the ijazas first. So in other words, a family affair of education. Okay. And indeed, we see this in Nuaimi's own entries himself. Also in the sphere, now moving to the more formal part, is the Maktab. And I've already mentioned earlier the Muaddib al-Atfal, the primary school teacher, as playing a very central role and a formative role in the educational experience of society. Okay, so Nuaimi saw it worthy, for example, of mentioning the Muaddib al-Atfal in his dictionary of educational roles, and pointing out especially the virtue of these people. Okay, so he often mentions not just their name, but also where they're buried in Damascus. Okay, where of course the assumption then is that people would visit these places and pray for the deceased teachers, not just scholars who are famous in the madrasas, but also of the maktabs. Okay, and we see, and we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the practices of the madrasa, of the maktab, excuse me. Okay, so here, for example, is just a short list of some of the maktabs in Damascus at the time, attached either to colleges, attached to mosques, and sometimes maktabs or children's schools that were instituted at the edges of turbas or of cemeteries throughout the city, each with their own endowments, each ensuring that orphans, for example, Dar al-Quran al-Wajihiyya that he mentions, number 2, had rooms for 10 orphans each, with a master dedicated to teaching just the orphans of the city or of that region. Okay, others of these were specified just for females, such as Turba al-Kamaliya al-Salihiyya al-Barraniya, number 7, and also had a school for orphans there as well. Okay. There were a number of public events that marked the initiation of these children into the academic path, into formal learning. These included the first congregational prayer of children as a very public event. It included public recitals or auditions of hadith, for example, in the hadith colleges, specifically for children. And it also includes, for example, khatams of hadith works. So the recitation and closing gathering at the very end of reciting, for example, Sahih al-Bukhari from beginning to end, with an ijazah specifically for the children recorded as official attendees. As far as the content of children's education in these mektabs or other local institutions, such as the neighborhood mosque, this usually comprised reading and writing, numeracy and literacy, memorization of part or the whole of the Quran, and memorization of a short work of fiqh, of ahkam. In other words, the positive rules of moral law, so that the children learn from a young age correct action. Okay, so these were some of the elementary stages. And then in the post-elementary stages, often grammar and usul. Now, I just want to emphasize one final time the centrality of the role of the Muaddib. Okay, the Muaddib was seen as a social notable, and the righteous of them were commemorated. As I mentioned earlier, their tombs, the location of their tombs were deemed worthy of mention. So that, in other words, what does this entail? What does this indicate? That society saw it fit to commemorate these people who play such an important role in the educational functions of society. Okay? And likewise, we see that through the Muaddib, children often started, on average, their education at the age of 6. This is something that I've analyzed from the biographical entries of Nu'aymi, and usually graduated after finishing both the Mektab and then also the Madrasa around the age of 20. Finally, that the primary purpose of the child's education, as we've said, is adab, of what is proper conduct, what is the proper way of controlling the human body. So in other words, what kind of bodily sensibilities were meant to be produced. I borrow this term from the work of Rudolf Ware in 2014 entitled The Walking Quran, Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge, and History in West Africa, a book that I recommend for those who are interested in how education, for example, in West Africa was also understood and practiced. Okay. So that was a quick treatment of the Mektab. Let's turn now to the Madrasa. Here you see an analysis of the number of different types of madrasas or colleges and academies in Damascus at the time of Nu'aymi, or in the century or two before Nu'aymi. So as you can see, a great number of academies here. I'm sorry, that number shouldn't be 311, but I believe 111, excuse me for the, I think the mistake, or perhaps a bit higher. No, actually, I'm sorry, it's correct, 311 institutions. Now, how was the intellect understood to be formed? So what was the intellectual formation of the scholar? How do we know about this? Through two fashions. Number one, through an analysis of the networks of scholars. This is, of course, the field of prosopography, the study of intellectual networks of scholars. This is a brief outline, graph that I developed of some of the scholars during the Mamluk period in Egypt and in Syria. And it's through prosopographical analysis of works like Nu'aymi's that we can identify not just the names of prominent educators, but we can also learn which teachers were most important to a scholar's own educational and intellectual formation. So what you see on your screen here right now are groupings of scholars. Nu'aymi took pains in his unwan to mention not only which scholars were descendants of previously notable scholars, but also, as I've mentioned before, where each scholar was buried and in proximity to whom. So if a scholar was buried next to a notable man or a notable woman, Nu'aymi went out of his way to note this, a point which we'll come back to in a moment. As far as the curriculum, the subjects and the works, the intermediate stage at studying in a college is what you see here: language, balagha, morphology, hadith. And in the more advanced stage then, jurisprudence, law, and here's some examples from the two dominant madhabs during his own time. Now, this should not make us think that other more speculative or philosophical subjects were not taught. They were. But they weren't taught primarily in the madrasa. They were taught in a range of other institutions. But in the words of Tajuddin as-Subki, one of the Shafi'i scholars of the 14th century, he says in his text, Mu'id al-Ni'am, he says, don't even contemplate studying philosophy and its sciences like logic until you've mastered the madrasa curriculum of moral theology, of fiqh, and of jurisprudence, of Quran, and of hadith. In other words, root yourself first in what it means to be a Muslim, and then by all means delve into the philosophical sciences. So this is the madrasa. As I said earlier, the madrasa's corollary, the other half of the educational experience, was in the hospice, the khanaqa or the tekke, the zawiya. And this is where, as opposed to the madrasa, that the institution, the madrasa being the institution that cultivated the positivistic forms of knowledge, ta'aleem and tadris, it was in the tekke or the khanaqa where ihsan was cultivated. So this was the institution for cultivating the inner dimensions, the ta'deeb of the human individual. So unlike the master of a madrasa, the Sheikh al-Ta'aleem, in the hospice, we had the Sheikh al-Tarbiyah, the training master, the one who trained the individual's inner dimensions. And here I'd like to quote a famous Sufi author, Aziz Din al-Nasafi, the author of the very famous tract Al-Insan al-Kamil, who writes, and I quote, "One must first attend the madrasa. There, he must learn the religious sciences in whatever else is taught there," meaning the ancillary disciplines. From the madrasa, he must proceed to the khanaqa and become a murid of a sheikh, the Sheikh al-Tarbiyah, the training master. Whoever proceeds in this way, An-Nasafi says, shall attain his goal and shall obtain he, capital H, who is sought. And whoever does not proceed in this manner shall attain neither. In other words, what is An-Nasafi saying? That the moral formation of the human being must be rooted in both ilm, positivistic knowledge, but also in ihsan, in a witnessing of the ontological order, a witnessing that everything is a creation and existentiation by Allah, by the divine. Okay, so this is what is often referred to in the literature of the Sufis as shuhud. Okay, now with this background, I just want to say a few remarks, having spoken about the first five. Libraries, hospitals, observatories, these were the institutions in which the more formal and what we would call today scientific branches of knowledges were taught. And so, as I said, the fact that you didn't have madrasas specifically for philosophy does not mean that it was not taught, but it was often taught as part of natural philosophy in these institutions. Likewise, in the workshops of the craftsmen, or the guilds, in other words, something that is the asnaf or the hiraf, especially in the Ottoman era. We know, for example, that in this period, any craftsman that joined the workshop or joined a guild was often taught through the Futuhat-names rules of modesty, rules of self-control, rules of service and of brotherhood. Okay, that there was a oath taken towards a culture of poverty, not meaning that one was materially poor, but that one didn't see the craft as a means of personal enrichment, but rather of aiding society more broadly. So in other words, it was an egalitarian tendency. Okay, and here I refer people who might be interested in some of the more recent works edited by Suraya Faruqi in the past 15 years. Complexes such as in Maragha, in Istanbul, in Cairo, Timurid, Iran, in which madrasas, tekkes, hospitals were often combined into one large institution. This is a development in the 1400s and 1500s. And finally, I already mentioned earlier how sometimes institutions of learning could be found even in the cemeteries. And Nuaimi has an entire chapter on cemeteries as places of learning. Okay, so this has been a very quick typology of the places of learning. Okay, but what I think has been notable, from the family to the workshops of the guilds, to the Madrasa, to the Khanaqah, is that in Nuaimi's works, the focus has always been on the ta'deeb, ultimately the formation of the human person, and on the importance of the teacher in this formation of the human being. Okay, a point that we'll come back to as we begin to close our presentation. But before doing this, I want to ask a question for us to think about, which is why? Why the focus on the person of the person of learning? In other words, Nuaimi is writing books on the institution, so why not focus on the institutions? Why this focus on the individual? And I think here the answer we can tease out from Nuaimi's own writing. At the very beginning of his book, Ad-Daris, fi Tarikh al-Madaris, Nuaimi quotes one of his teachers, a Qadiri Sufi master by the name of Zainuddin Abu al-Khair Muflih al-Habashi, who writes, God Most High placed learning and oppression overwhelmingly in cities, and he placed wealth, rizq, and ignorance in the rural countryside. It is by the learning of the ulama, of the scholars of the city, that God Most High drives wealth from the countryside to the cities. In other words, through the awqaf and the endowments. And it is by the ignorance of the ignorant of the countryside that God Most High drives to them the oppression of the cities. The oppression being, of course, the rulers and military political commanders of his age. He says, Nuaimi comments, he says, therefore, learning is a cause for the driving of wealth to those who possess it, as well as to the rest of the people of the city, including the rulers, the elite, and others of the generality. And he mentions that it's also by learning that oppression is therefore warded off. Now, the relationship between the urban and the rural in this economic terms lies at the heart of what Nuaimi sees as their mutual flourishing, which is knowledge. Knowledge is the crux. Okay. Yes, the rural countryside is where real wealth, rizq, literally provisions or sustenance, is produced. But it is through learning that this rizq is transferred. And it is through learning that oppression is warded off from all of the lands, from the city and from the countryside. Okay. In fact, it's in the introduction to Ad-Daris that Nuaimi says that the very reason that he wrote this book is to point out how that the endowing, the awqaf, of institutions of learning is the instrument by which God brings good to the cities and to society. The agents of learning are human persons. So that's the teachers and it's the students who practice their scholarly calling. It's the charitable founders who establish colleges to house these scholars in the cities and to finance them with endowments that brings the real wealth produced in the rural country into the cities. So in other words, it's these agents, the teachers and the scholars, that should really deserve society's gratitude through remembrance and through support. And this is why books like Nu'aymi's make a point of showing where are the scholars buried. Where did they operate in their lives, in the colleges, in other words, and where do they rest after their lives, in the cemeteries, as memoria of those scholars' services to society and of the good that the scholars' learning brought. In other words, what am I saying? That the human landmarks of learning in life and in death situate the moral topography of the city. Okay, and this is why Nu'aymi spends as much time as he does in his books pointing out both where ulama were in their lives and where ulama are in their death. So it's the moral dimension of learning that we can extract from the tabaqat and the histories of scholars like Nu'aymi, which were produced by a society for whom the moral dimension of learning is paramount. And if we ignore this, we run the risk of fundamentally misunderstanding the purpose of tabaqat, like al-Unwan, or histories like the Daris that Nu'aymi authored. So, to begin to conclude now, perhaps just 5 minutes, and we'll conclude this and open up for questions. Hopefully, I started by posing some questions. Okay, what type of human person does the educational culture of madrasas and the other institutions produce? What kind of institutions cultivated this and their practices? And what was the vision of the nature and purpose of knowledge? The first two questions I think we've treated at some length. I'd like to turn now to the final third one in our conclusion. Okay, that is to say, what is the relationship of the social experience of the madrasa and its education to ensuring the unity and ordering of knowledge on the one hand, while empowering the scholars outside of the madrasa curriculum to continue to learn and to teach. In other words, when they've graduated from the madrasa. So to address this, we need to spend just a moment on the nature of knowledge and of learning as it was understood in pre-modern Muslim societies. So the first point I want to emphasize is that if you read the books of scholars such as Ibn al-Akfani or a whole range of philosophical or Sharia scholars, Tashkuprezada and many others, they are emphatic that there is a unity to knowledge. There is a unity to knowledge. That is to say that reality is one, and the sciences, the ulum, are different ways of making that reality intelligible to the human mind. Okay? In other words, if there is a understanding that knowledge is one ultimately, that there's a unity of knowledge, then any approach to learning that fragments this knowledge, be that fragmentation in an individual human being, or in the institutions of learning, or in society, that this fragmentation must be protected against. All right? In other words, we go back to what we said a few minutes ago. By emphasizing the person of learning, this ensures the integrity of the cognitive, the intellectual, the affective or the intuitive aspect of the human being and the moral aspect of the human being. In other words, ultimately, it ensures that the human being understands the place of the human within the cosmos and in relationship to the divine ontologically. Okay, we can see this reflected in Tajuddin as-Subki, who I mentioned a little bit earlier. When he speaks about the purpose of scholars, he says ultimately scholars are there. What is the role of scholars in society, in creation, in fact? He says the role of a scholar is to serve, khidmah, to serve others and to empower them with knowledge, and to remind mankind of the ephemeral nature of this world's existence. So he says, following Al-Ghazali and following, in fact, the Quran, he says the lowest degree of knowledge is to realize the insignificance, the worthlessness, the turbidity, and the ephemerality of this world, of the dunya, and the magnificence and purity and perpetuity of the next world. So in summary, what is he saying? That something cannot be called knowledge if it does not ultimately point beyond itself as an ayah to the reality of this world and the reality of man's existence in this world and in the next, in eternity. Okay, now I want to just throw out a few points that might be interesting to those who are listening, if they are especially interested in the history of education, both in the East and in the Muslim world and in European realms in the West. Now, historians such as Marshall Hodgson, Wa'il Hallaq, George Saliba, they've pointed out how there was in Europe in the early modern period what Marshall Hodgson calls a great Western transmutation, a change in European societies that ultimately came to dominate and affect other societies, Muslim and otherwise. When it comes to education and knowledge in society, I think there's a handful of major historical shifts that, again, scholars such as Hallaq and Saliba have pointed out that are important when we think about the purpose of a madrasa education and how it's been transformed in the modern world, in the contemporary world. The first historical shift is in the very meaning of science. Okay, George Saliba, for example, has pointed out in some of his lectures and writings how the understanding of science shifted from an Aristotelian certainty, in other words, seeking out knowledge that a person can be certain of, ultimately rooted in the divine, similar to what we just heard from Subki, for example, a few minutes ago, to knowledge as a producer of capital and knowledge as a type of investment. In other words, it's a change from how we understand the very purpose of knowledge. And this happened at the same time in the early 16th and early 17th century, for example, in which new institutions were developed in Europe, such as academies and royal societies, the development of things like the patent, in which a person could own knowledge. So for example, the famous scientist Galileo Galilei, he sells the Medici stars. In other words, he capitalizes on his scientific investments. Knowledge, in other words, is commercialized. Okay, so we've gone from knowledge being a moral enterprise to being a commercial, mercantilistic enterprise. We shift from colleges to universities. Okay, so whereas the type of institution that we've been talking about, the Madrasa, the college, even in Europe in the 13th and 14th century, following very similar patterns where it's master to student, in the 16th and 17th centuries, we have a shift to the university as being the institution that grants, as George Muqdisi and others have outlined, that it's no longer the master of the college who certifies the student, but it's the institution that certifies the student. And in the 19th century, we see a shift to the modern research university, the goal of which is no longer to produce the type of scholars we talked about earlier in the pre-modern Muslim understanding, but more limited professionals who can serve, especially in this more commercialized understanding of knowledge and in a newly professionalized scientific setting of the 19th and 20th centuries, in an industrialized setting in which the state is the ultimate, not the divine, but the state determines what is the right use of society as society's energies and resources. So in other words, an instrumentalist approach to knowledge, and knowledge especially of the natural world and of man. We have a shift in the 16th and 17th century, likewise, from an emphasis on knowledge being ordered, there being a hierarchy of knowledge, to rather a curriculum. Curriculum here being a reconfiguring concept in which, in light with Calvinist understandings of society in the 16th and 17th century, there was an idea that education must become universal, mass education must be controlled by the state, newly liberated from Catholic Rome, and that the ultimate purpose of this mass education should be to produce an objective science within a bureaucracy managed by the state. A form of education, so a curriculum, a course, taken from the idea that like a course that horses would run through, managed by the state that is teacher-proof. So we've shifted from the center of education being the teacher-student relationship to an understanding of education that is state-controlled, in which the teacher is just a dispenser of education. So it's an apersonal, a non-personal pedagogy. Again, for what objective? For the objective of a centralized, powerful state controlling society. And finally, the final shift, drawing on the research of al-Hallaq, who himself draws very heavily on al-Ghazali and on others like Foucault, a shift from tazkiyah, or internal ta'deeb and discipline, which we talked about earlier, to, as the way of changing the human soul, in other words, internal discipline, tazkiyah, to coercion, or state discipline. So in other words, an erasure of all institutions and all the practices of institutions that existed in the pre-modern world, like the tekke, like the zawiya and the khaniqah, and in some countries in the 20th century, a literal erasure by closing the tekkes and zawiyas, and replacing them with the state, and state coercion as a form of social control. The state is the guarantor, in other words, of a more secular paradise on earth. And so what al-Hallaq outlines here, and this is the final point perhaps that we'll begin to close with, is that we've shifted from internal self-regulation of the soul and of the self and of the body to an externally imposed regulation. So now the Madrasa and the tekke no longer serve the role that they used to, and the state and its forms of education and control and discipline take its place. And here, of course, we no longer need then the master, be it a master of ta'aleem or a master of ta'deeb, because their roles have been usurped by state education. In closing, and in contrast, what we can say is that we see in the work of Nuaimi as supplemented by the other authors that we've studied, such as Nasafi and Ghazali and Subki, that there is no educational institution worthy of the name of education if it does not cultivate the human person as a moral agent as well as an intellectual agent in the vision of these authors. So in this framework, adab, the inculcation of propriety and of the correct relationship of things to things. So the adab of the human to God, the adab of the human to their fellow humans, the adab of a human towards the natural world. Adab is the fulcrum, we could say, between the cognitive education, the rational or positivistic, the affective or the emotional and internal education, and the performative, in other words, how one should carry oneself, bodily comportment or embodiment of knowledge. So there's a strong emphasis, in other words, in the writings of Nu'aymi and many of these pre-modern Muslim authors, that the moral is necessary to ensure the maqsad, or the ultimate aim and purpose of education, and that it is at the heart of a madrasa education, which is to protect the human intellect. I'm sure many people listening are familiar with the 5 maqasid of Sharia, and one of the highest of these, of course, after the hifz al-din, is the hifz al-aql, the protection of the human intellect or the heart. Because as many of these authors write, without a moral disposition, true intelligence is not possible. Why? Because the heart can be clouded over by the lower passions. And this is why authors such as Subki and others quote the Quranic verse that warns against the hearts being blemished or covered over. Bal rana ala qulubihim. And so they say that true knowledge of placing things in their proper places and proper relationship cannot be attained, true knowledge cannot be attained without a moral intelligence. So in short, the ultimate purpose then of a madrasa education is to preserve those branches of learning, to preserve learning of the revelation of the Quran, of the Hadith, of fiqh, and of the ancillary disciplines, ulum al-ala, that help preserve the human constitution. So was the madrasa the only institution of learning, or one might even ask, must it be the only institution of learning today? I think the answer of Nu'aymi and Subki and others, as we've seen earlier, would be no. But that without a madrasa education, the ultimate objectives of other institutions of knowledge, be other disciplines of knowledge, such as engineering or economics or politics, can become imbalanced if the purpose of a madrasa objective is not preserved in a society. Because only through knowing the highest purposes of a formal positivistic knowledge, the kind of knowledge taught in a madrasa, can all other orders of knowledge in human society be kept in balance. In conclusion, knowledge is the preserve of a moral agent, the human being, and not the preserve of institutions. That is to say, the highest purpose of a madrasa is to form a fully and truly human being. Thank you.
We thank you, Ustaz Talal Al-Azem, for this wonderful presentation. Actually, we have some questions. Maybe I can ask the first question myself. sometimes people they mention the negative aspects of the madrasas in pre-modern periods. What do you think about this? In your research, did you see some, negative aspects, or why? And lastly, you mentioned historical shifts. Why did it happen? So, what's your answer for this question?
Okay, thank you. As for the first question, yes. In fact, as I mentioned towards the beginning of the presentation, when discussing how there was a new genre of writing, the manuals of adab for madrasa education, such as the book of Ibn Jama'ah, he actually spends a lot of his time talking about the dangers of madrasas. Tajuddin as-Subki, who I mentioned, likewise does this in his book. He talks about a lot of the problems that arise in a professionalized system of education, where there's so much money being channeled effectively, and how sometimes this leads to negative qualities in the teachers or the students, but also how it can lead to an imbalance sometimes in the intellectual output. And it's for this very reason that I think authors like Ibn Jama'ah wrote their books. As I said, compared to the book of Zarnuji, who about 200 years before him, before the madrasas, Ibn Jama'ah is primarily concerned with ensuring that the adab of education in a madrasa culture, like that of Damascus or Istanbul or Cairo or elsewhere, is ensured, and this adab being the protector against some of the problems that arise with the madrasas. So he has chapters after chapters trying to show what the problems are and how to solve these problems through a proper understanding of the role of a madrasa. That's for the first question. If you might remind me the second question as to the shifts.
Why these shifts happened? You mentioned, you said commercialization of the madrasas, or from college to university, etc. Some change happened in the last centuries.
Yes.
What were the reasons? Political, or there were some other reasons?
Also a very good question. The answer, of course, is complex. The shifts that I pointed out largely took place, and maybe I wasn't very clear about this, largely took place first in Europe after the Reformation and in the 16th and 17th centuries. And then, as historians like Hodgson and Halak have shown, through colonialism and imperialism, this model was then spread to the newly colonized lands, both, again, Muslim, but also non-Muslim lands as well. And so the institutions, be they of education or of law or of medicine that existed in these lands, were refashioned in light of European institutions and understandings of knowledge or of law, etc. So we see, for example, in North Africa under French colonial rule, or in the Middle East, or likewise in India, but also then in other countries that were not colonized but underwent rapid forms of nationalization, of nation state formation, especially after World War I. We see the adoption, sometimes very quick and sometimes unreflective adoption, as well Halak argues in his more recent books over the past 12 years, of institutions and understandings of knowledge from, again, European society. Whereas in European society, you can trace some of these ideas back to the Reformation and some of the issues that they were facing in the 15th and 16th centuries that didn't necessarily apply or should not have applied to societies that did not share that same historical genealogy. So in other words, what I'm saying in short here is that it's through these different, especially in the colonial and in the period of nation state formation, that institutions and understandings of knowledge, such as the commercialization of knowledge, was often either imposed or, in the rush to create nation states, uncritically adopted, and in ways that then posed very serious challenges to traditional Muslim understandings of knowledge and institutions of learning.
Okay, we have a question. The question is, I will read it. Has there been ilm al-khilaf education in the madrasas during these periods? If so, what works, kutub, have been taught? If not, what could be the reasons for this?
Ilm al-khilaf.
Ilm al-khilaf education. Has there been ilm al-khilaf education in the madrasas?
In some of the madrasas, historically, yes. Again, just to be very clear, madrasa is a broad term to simply indicate a college. And as I showed earlier, there was various types of colleges. Colleges for Quran, colleges for Hadith, colleges for fiqh, colleges for medicine, etc. So in the colleges dedicated largely to fiqh, to law, which historically were the earliest madrasas, yes, ilm al-khilaf was often taught. And in the later periods, by which I mean the 16th century to the 18th and 19th century, when these complexes that I pointed out earlier developed, then yes, ilm al-khilaf and how differences between madhabs were developed, how they could be approached, sometimes how they could be resolved. There was entire books in ilm al-khilaf, or especially in fiqh, that were taught, that were written and taught in the madrasas. And it was also a subject that was sometimes taught outside of the madrasa. As I said earlier, the madrasa was not the only site of education. And so again, sometimes even if a person didn't study something in the madrasa, they would be studying them in the mosque or in small halaqas, for example, in the mosque or teachers' homes or in other institutions. So in short, yes, we do have evidence. If you look at the syllabi, or the what people studied in for example, Mughal India, or in Ottoman madrasas in the 15th, 16th century, we do have evidence of ilm al-khilaf being taught.
Okay, another question: were there important differences between different madhabs, madrasas, or they were similar?
As far as madrasa education is concerned, the approach was very similar, because by the period in which the madrasas arose in the 12th, first with Nizam al-Mulk in Seljuk, Iran, and then throughout, well, not first, but in that period, and then from there into the rest of the Muslim world. By this period, basically, the madhabs had settled upon the four that we know today in the Sunni world, and likewise in Shi'i societies upon the Ja'fari or Zaydi schools where they existed. So as a result of this, the approach to the education of madhab fiqh, the educational approach of mutun and shuruh, and the way that the commentaries and the hashiyas were taught in madrasas was relatively uniform across madhabs, and in fact even across societies. I say relatively because there were changes in some times in some places, but when it came to fiqh education, the way that a Maliki in a madrasa or the way that a Hanbali in a madrasa would teach and that a student would graduate was often very, very similar. Now, we have to remember that we're speaking about in cities and cultures in which the madrasa was the centerpiece of education of law. I am not speaking here in institutions of, let's say, 19th century West Africa or of other cultures in which perhaps the madrasa as the institution we know was not the main place of learning. The Mahdar, for example, in West Africa had a slightly different approach. But again, I point you in the direction of specialist authors like Rudolf Ware's book, The Walking Quran, for more details on that form of education.
Two questions from one of our guests. The first one, does the Madrasa education system continue to this day? And can you give examples of institutions that are using the current Madrasa education system?
I'm more of a historian than I am of a specialist in contemporary, but there are, to my understanding, yes. I mean, from Mauritania to Morocco to Egypt, Damascus, the Yemen, institutions in Anatolia and in Istanbul and in India. There are still madrasas that in Pakistan, for example, in Iran, Iraq, there are still institutions that to various or varying degrees do still aim ultimately at developing the type of teaching and educational process that we talked about here. Often they are compromised. In other words, they have to make compromises in order to fulfill national requirements, but they still take very seriously the moral and integrative imperative of the Madrasa as outlined in today's presentation. In some places, for example, in Cairo, I've been told that there are renewed efforts at reviving this type of approach, for example, in some of the sub programs of the Azhar and other institutions. So again, I think one would need to speak to specialists for more details as to where exactly some of these approaches continue to thrive. But to my understanding from other colleagues who have better knowledge of this than I, yes, like I said, from Pakistan and India to Iran to Turkey to Egypt, Morocco, these things can and are often still found.
Another question. You focused on the adab dimension. Can you give more information about the Muaddip?
Okay, very good. This is actually something that relatively little has been written about. And in fact, I hope to address in some more detail in the book that I'm authoring right now, which is how was the Muaddib understood, what role, with some of the things we talked about today, and some of the practices that the Muaddib employed in the teaching of the children. As I said, we have some very scant, sketchy information as to some of the educational practices for primary aged or the elementary aged students. We have some information as to, as we said, initial literacy, numeracy, ensuring that students could read and write and count, the education of the Quran, in other words, also the faculty of memory, as being something that was cultivated in very young children as well. And finally, as we touched upon very briefly in the presentation, that deep in the sense of teaching the young children how to carry themselves physically. In other words, physical comportment. What is the right manners of eating? What is the right manners of sitting? What is the right manners of speaking, of engaging? All of these things were actually part of the child's education. They weren't just on the side. They weren't accidental things that you hope the child would pick up, but they were part of the responsibility of the Muaddib al-Atfal. So they ensure that you have a human being that's not left to grow wild, so to speak, but has been formed and informed into a somebody who has self-control.
Okay, we have two more questions. The first one, you as a terminology, you used positivistic for ta'lim and tadris.
Yes.
So can we use another term for the ta'lim and tadris. What's your opinion?
I welcome any alternative suggestions. The reason I use the term positivistic is to indicate that there are aspects of the Islamic educational provision that were formal and positivized, like law, okay, like lugha, like language, like hadith, like the qira'at. You know, these things were not subjectivist, but there was a concrete and standard measure. In opposition to which there were forms of knowledge recognized and respected as part of, again, the educational experience that were more intuitive, more speculative, and more experiential. And that the human being as a student, a scholar, was not complete until they had both aspects. Now, if the term positivistic has other connotations that the questioner is perhaps uncomfortable with, I'd welcome, I'd be very happy to hear alternative terms. But I use the term in order to indicate this dual nature, that educational theory in Islamic culture recognized both positivistic and what we might call more intuitive or subjectivist aspects of learning and of knowledge.
Okay, thank you. Our last question, can you give me more information about the network of scholars? I think you mentioned briefly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is the question.
It's a very big question, because there was thousands upon thousands of networks over 1400 years. I think the main point I was trying to indicate here is that by studying the networks of scholars, be they in 15th century Cairo and Damascus, be they in, let's say, 16th century Delhi and India, or anywhere for that matter, one can see how ideas moved, how ideas were developed over time, and how they interacted with new cultures. One of the interesting points that I mentioned Ibn Jubayr in my presentation, and again, as we know, Ibn Jubayr traveled widely. Ibn Battuta likewise, from Spain to the Middle East to India and elsewhere. And they often pointed out the cities of learning and the interconnectedness of these cities. In other words, students were expected to spend time in various places and to seek knowledge in various lands and countries. This all cultivated very dense networks over time. And in other times and places, people often focused only on a smaller subset of networks. So the question as posed is a little bit too big. And so all I would say is, perhaps if you take a look at studies and books that have focused specifically on some of these networks of learning, what comes to mind are some of the books of, let's say, again, George Maqdisi in The Rise of Colleges. He talks about this for the early period of the 11th and 12th centuries. You have the book by Professor Recep Şentürk, who talked about some of the networks for other hadith scholars and other scholars. You have the writings, the writings of Professor K.A. Nizami, an Indian scholar from the last century, who wrote a lot about the networks of scholars and of mystics, of Sufis of India and of Central Asia. So I would point the questioner to these books for more details as to the particulars of the networks of scholars. But the point I just wanted to say now is that by studying networks of scholarship, you can see how a scholar was formed, what impacted upon the formation of a scholar.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Al-Azem, for this beneficial presentation. Actually, I learned a lot, inshallah. Next time, inshallah, we meet in Istanbul in the Sahn-ı, inshallah. So I would like to thank you again on behalf of Fatih Sahn-ı, and I thank all guests, inshallah. So, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to everyone. Okay, see you inshallah again. Barakallah.
Thank you.